Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for another episode of Teaching Writing in College, where the driving question is, how can instructors in higher education leverage theory, science, pedagogy, and craft most effectively to help their learners with writing? And I have to apologize. I'm just remembering that I have not created a title for this episode yet, but it's going to be about teaching evidence and the STAR criteria by Richard Fulkerson. And I'm just going to walk through an activity that I did here recently with a couple of my classes. And I think a couple of things about this activity, a couple of caveats. One is that it could get kind of long, and it kind of does for me. And so sometimes I break it up a little bit, and I actually did do that. But I have a few different things in here that I think are useful. And it's good sometimes to break it up and do shorter bits of activity with any given concept. In this case, since it's the STAR criteria, it's about evidence. It's about using evidence or support and just evaluating that evidence. I think it's a really great framework. And along the way, I will also share where I found it. And I've been using it for quite a long time. I think it's really helpful for a lot of things. It's helpful for student writing, of course, and lots of genres, but also things like reflections, because reflections really are genres too. And I think it's important to also remember that reflection is a skill, and that's also something that can be taught. It's something that I, as I've thought about how I would like my students to reflect, it also gives me an opportunity to think about how I would reflect and how I would use evidence in my own reflection on my own teaching, how I would think about it, and how I would like my students to think about it. But I'll just go ahead and move forward here. I guess one more thing to say is that, evidence, one thing I'm going to try to do in this presentation, or one thing that I do with students all the time, is I try to get them to think about evidence not just as the kind of hard evidence where you're supposed to go to the library and you're supposed to find some statistics or something, because that's kind of the way that we think about evidence in a, commonly. But I think evidence really can be more nuanced than that. The STAR criteria can help with that. I think as long as somebody keeps in mind that, how the STAR criteria get applied and what they mean in a given context can kind of shift and change because the expectations shift and change. It's all about expectations for audiences and the genres that are being used. In some genres, you would use hard evidence from a scientific study, but in others you wouldn't. And so it's a matter of just thinking flexibly and thinking rhetorically about evidence. That's really important. Here's the first slide that I often use, asking students to get ready with their notes, and those are the things that I ask them for: their name in the GCU system here where I work, also their preferred name so that I can call them by what they would like to be called, their major, their anticipated career, their group number, and the date. This is especially useful when it's early in the semester. I'm getting to know students' names, but it's also useful later because as I'm, passing things back to them, I can be reminded of, what they are going into, and I can remember to talk to them about that just in, short conversations, casual conversations in the classroom, or also I can bring things in from some of those majors or some of those anticipated careers so that we can talk about them and they can think a little bit about their writing future. So something that I really like to do with them a lot. So that's what this slide is all about. Next slide, I've got this cue here, STAR criteria, and by this point in the semester, I've already talked with them about the STAR criteria, and so I'm just here reviewing. I'm asking them to think once again about what the STAR criteria stand for. I give them an opportunity to tease their brain a little bit to get just a kind of a warm-up with their mind as to what the STAR criteria stand for, and of course they stand for sufficient, typical, accurate, and relevant. Those are the items that, and those are the things that the STAR criteria stand for. And then in this case, once again, just for review, just to practice using it, I have this next slide. The cue is evidence meets STAR, question mark. And then from there I have a YouTube video, and in this particular case it was a video that I found where it was from some British comedians. It's a British comedy show, and I'm sorry to say that I don't know the names of the comedians very well, but it was a great example. And it's a little bit of a talk show, and they let this one comedian spend a little bit of time talking about a run-in he had with the authorities because he apparently had not parked his car correctly. He had parked it in what they call a taxi rank, so a place where taxis are supposed to be able to go, but his car apparently was blocking the way. But it gave this picture, and the joke is simply, he's riding back and forth with the traffic authorities there, trying to get his ticket rescinded or dismissed. And as he's doing that, he's using this picture and talking about how the picture doesn't actually show a taxi rank at all. It just shows his car with the words taxi rank written on the window. And so he uses that as evidence to say that, well, he says it's really not evidence actually that he's parked in a taxi rank. And there's some laughs along the way. And it's a pretty good example that could be used with the STAR criteria. And so I ask students, is this evidence, this picture, sufficient, typical, accurate, or relevant when it comes to a parking fine? And they have an opportunity to talk about that. We talk about it a little bit as a class. And I also present to them the STAR criteria. This is a sample that I have. I originally got the STAR criteria from Ramage, Bean, and Johnson's Writing Arguments, which I used extensively, especially earlier in my career. And one of the things that I really have enjoyed doing over my career is going back with textbooks and finding places where the textbook authors got their ideas. And so this is something that Ramage, Bean, and Johnson used to frame the use of evidence. And they've got a table. I'm sorry to say I can't remember which edition of Ramage, Bean, and Johnson this one is. I went back and looked at a couple of them. I know it's not the 9th edition, it's not the 8th, and I don't think it's the 6th. But and I couldn't find. I've been collecting those over the years, and I couldn't find the actual edition that this particular table comes from. But Ramage, Bean, and Johnson's Writing Arguments, and they got it from Richard Fulkerson. They credit Richard Fulkerson and his book, Teaching the Argument in Writing, which was published by the National Council of Teachers of English, the NCTE, in 1996. And pages 44 to 53, I went back and I bought that book too. I was looking for it on my shelf before this, before recording this episode. I'm sorry to say I couldn't find it either, but I went back and bought that book and read that section, and it's something I like to do. I like to go back and collect ideas and then figure out where they really came from and use them in class when I can. But that's where it came from. Excuse me. And I like this table because it has a little explainer. I also sometimes use my own examples of these, or ask students sometimes to come up with their own examples. Another way to do the STAR criteria is through that. Excuse me. And so then what I do is I ask them to apply the STAR criteria to this study on the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. So this is one that I went back and found in the New England Journal of Medicine from December 31st, 2020. So this was still when the vaccines were being vetted when the COVID pandemic hit. And they had published this study, and I'm sure there were probably other ones. I thought this would be a really great example just to get students thinking and give them an opportunity to apply the STAR criteria. And so that's the title page that I have there, and it's got the abstract with background, methods, results, and conclusions. And so what I do is I use that to get them thinking and give them an example. I put it on this slide in a way that I can read it to them all at once, and they can look for clues about sufficiency, typicality, accuracy, and relevance in terms of the how effective the vaccine is in the study. And then I also ask them just kind of a bonus questions. Do you see any limitations here? And I give them a chance to talk through each of those with each other, and then we have a discussion as a class. But so once again, just from the abstract here, I think it's enough to discuss the STAR criteria, to apply it, and so on. And so there's the COVID vaccine study. And then another one that I have that I like to do is I like to ask them in groups to list as many types of evidence as they can think of. And I ask them to think of a range of evidence because, I'm leading them up to the idea that, evidence really ultimately is rhetorical. We have to think of it rhetorically, and different kinds of evidence work best in different situations. And so to kind of get them ready for that, I ask them to think of a range of different kinds of evidence, from hard evidence to soft evidence. And so one example is clinical trials like the COVID study. Another example is the picture of the car that may or may not have been parked in a taxi rank, just to follow up on the conversations we've been having. And so then another one that I like to do sometimes is their own reasoning with actual arguments, some hypothetical examples here. And so this is a case from a school shooting. The name of the person was Kip Kinkle, and it was in Oregon. And was it in Oregon? It was in Oregon, and it happened about a year before Columbine. And so it's lesser known. Columbine, of course, was very widely known, but this one I don't think people know quite as much. But it's a similar kind of thing that happened. And what's going on in this particular screenshot is the school shooter, Kip Kinkle, is asking to have his sentence reduced in a court of appeals. And the judges here are issuing their opinion. And what they're doing is they're talking about a particular law, about how to balance the protection of society, personal responsibility, accountability, and reformation, and how those things all need to kind of be taken into consideration. But it also depends on the case. And so I have this part highlighted where they talk about two hypothetical examples where one person basically jaywalks, I think, because they're intoxicated, and the person goes into court and offers evidence that she didn't have a criminal history, had undergone significant treatment for alcohol abuse since the crime. The court might well determine that the defendant had accepted personal responsibility, was well on her way to rehabilitation, and that protection of society is of relatively less concern in determining the proper sentence to impose. So now I'm just reading from that court opinion. And then there's a hypothetical example that they use. On the other hand, if a remorseless defendant proudly accepts personal responsibility and vows to repeat it, the sentencing court properly may, under such circumstances, accord greater weight to the need for protection of society. And so they're always weighing these things. They've got the law there, Article 1, Section 15, protection of society, personal responsibility, accountability, and reformation. When they're making decisions like this, they have to weigh all of those. But they're saying that they have to weigh them differently based on the particulars of a case. And so they use these hypothetical examples as support or evidence for that. And so I give that one to students as well, so they can see another kind of evidence in action, and give them just an opportunity. How could the STAR criteria be applied to this evidence on this slide? And when I'm doing this, another thing that I think you might notice is that we're going from I do, we do, you do sort of model where, I'm giving students opportunities to see what's happening and how it gets applied, and then having them do it together, and then also giving them an opportunity to do it on their own, just to get a little bit of practice in some different ways here. And actually, in this case, I think if I remember right, we did two together. I do, we do, you do. I'm sorry, I'm flipping through my slides again a little bit. This first one with the taxi rank, that could be something that I would do. And then the COVID-19 one, I would have them do it together in groups. And then the reasoning with the arguments, the hypothetical examples from the court case, I would have them do on their own, just how the STAR criteria might be applied to that evidence. And then here's a second slide. I must have put two slides in here, but here's another one, hard and soft evidence, just going back to their list again, trying to think of more. And then so this time we've got clinical trials like the COVID vaccine study, we've got the hypothetical scenarios like the Oregon judges scenarios, and so on and so forth. So they're getting a range of evidence, and they get to think about a lot of different kinds of evidence here. And then back to this. This is a really good way, I think, to help students solidify their thinking by asking them to create some sort of generalization, some sort of general rule about how evidence works. And so just as a question for them, how would you answer this question? How does evidence work? And give them an opportunity now that they've seen lots of different kinds of it, and it's not all just, the typical evidence that we might think about as evidence, the hard evidence in scientific studies, but rather that there's a range. And so just giving them a chance to think back to what we just did and to generalize would be really helpful to them as well. And so giving them just a one-sentence answer, or having them do just a one-sentence answer or so, is really helpful here. And I guess one other thing that I can say, I'm sorry I don't have a slide for this, but to go back to reflections, metacognitive reflections, where I ask students to, think about their writing, do some self-assessment, think about their identity as a writer, think about how they might apply it in the future, and so on. There are different kinds of evidence that are really helpful for that, and maybe I'll do another episode on that soon. I am at a point in the semester where it's about time to submit some metacognitive reflections, and so maybe I'll do another episode on that as well. But I will also be asking my students, use the STAR criteria. Are you using evidence that will be sufficient, typical, accurate, and relevant for claims that you're making about your own writing? And it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to do it perfectly or that they have to know that they have made progress, but the idea there is just that they are pulling evidence from their writing, pulling evidence from knowledge that they have, and maybe I'll talk about that on another episode. If I didn't already, I think I may have done that on the podcast, but if I haven't, I might do it again. Or I might do it again anyway, just because I think it's important to talk about and useful. It's been very useful to me, especially in the age of AI, to be able to think about reflection and what counts as good evidence for reflection. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your tuning in, and I thank you for liking and subscribing, and I will continue to try to post these when I can, and I hope that your spring semester is going along well. Please travel safely if you're traveling for spring break. I know that's coming up over the next month or so for most schools. And I just wish you the best in everything that you do in the classroom. So thank you so much.